program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the December 15th, 2025 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: a breakout in transport stocks has brought relief to investors who fretted that the outsized influence of tech in this year's rally could leave the market vulnerable to a downturn if a few heavyweights drop. Ryder Systems longtime leader Robert Sanchez is retiring early next year as chief executive of the logistics and transportation company. SpaceX executives are starting the process to select Wall Street bankers to advise it on its IPO, with interested parties scheduled to make their initial pitches this week. Chief executives of some of the world's largest companies are all in on artificial intelligence, though many have yet to see meaningful returns on their investments, a CEO survey showed. OpenAI told staff that it was ending a compensation policy that required employees to work at the company for at least 6 months before their equity vest. Charles Schwab's CEO, Rick Wurster, counseled prudence when approaching markets, telling the Wall Street Journal that there was a bright line between investing and gambling. For the fourth time in 2 years, Armistice told investors who want to cash out that much of their money would likely be returned in the form of what was essentially IOUs. A number of U.S. companies have co-opted the word storyteller and applied it to vacancies they hope to fill in marketing, cybersecurity, and other roles not traditionally associated with it. Now for the key articles under the Worldwide section. 2 gunmen killed at least 15 people and injured more than 3 dozen during a Hanukkah event on Sydney's Bondi Beach in what officials called a terrorist attack on Australia's Jewish community. The attacker, who killed 3 Americans in an ambush on U.S. forces in Syria, was a member of the Syrian security forces who was set to be fired for holding extremist views. Trump's top envoys held 5 hours of talks with Ukraine's president in Berlin as the U.S. steps up pressure on Kyiv to seal a deal with Russia on ending the war. A Hong Kong court convicted media tycoon Jimmy Lai of violating a national security law in a case that could bring a life sentence. A manhunt was underway to find the shooter at Brown University, who left 2 dead and 9 injured. Trump conveyed uncertainty about whether Republicans would maintain control of the House in next year's midterm elections. Israel's military said it killed a Hamas commander in Gaza, the most senior military leader of the group to be killed there since a fragile ceasefire took effect. U.S. officials are seeking to recruit a multinational force of about 10,000 troops under an American general to stabilize post-war Gaza. Chileans elected as president hardline conservative Jose Antonio Cast, who won easily after vowing to clamp down on crime and illegal immigration. The picture on today's front page shows a young couple dressed in summer shorts crying as they stand before a huge pile of fresh flowers. And that caption reads, "Flowers were left Monday at Sydney's Bondi Beach, near where gunmen fired on a Hanukkah celebration. At least 15 people were killed and 3 dozen hurt in the Sunday attack. People's belongings were scattered at the scene of the Sydney attack, the country's worst shooting in nearly 30 years." The article, "Terror Attack in Australia Targets Jews. 2 gunmen opened fire on Hanukkah event in Sydney, killing at least 15," by Mike Cherney, Stuart Candy, and Rhiannon Hoyle. Sydney. 2 gunmen killed at least 15 people and injured more than 3 dozen during a Hanukkah event on Sunday on Sydney's Bondi Beach, in what officials called a terrorist attack on Australia's Jewish community. 1 suspect was also killed, and the other is in critical condition. It was the country's worst mass shooting in nearly 30 years. This attack was designed to target Sydney's Jewish community on the first day of Hanukkah, said Chris Minns, the Premier of New South Wales State, which includes Sydney. What should have been a night of peace and joy celebrated in that community with families and supporters has been shattered. Authorities haven't formally identified the shooters, but said one of them was a 50-year-old man police shot and killed at the scene. The other shooter is his 24-year-old son, who was taken to the hospital under police guard. Police added that the older man had 6 firearms licensed to him. Mike Burgess, who leads Australia's domestic intelligence agency, said one of the shooters in Sunday's attack was known to the agency, but hadn't been considered an immediate threat. Police didn't say what ideology motivated the men. Police said they located a vehicle near the attack site they believed held several improvised explosive devices, and a bomb disposal unit was still on the scene as of Sunday night. Police later said 2 basic but active devices were found. For many Australian Jews who had warned about increasing anti-Semitic incidents since the most recent Hamas-Israel war, the attack further eroded their sense of safety in a country that was previously viewed as a haven. There is no place for this hate, violence, and terrorism in our nation, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said. He added that an attack on Jewish Australians is an attack on every Australian. Despite Australia's reputation as a model for multiculturalism, the Hamas-Israel war has inflamed tensions. In 2 notable incidents recently, a Melbourne synagogue was firebombed, and there was a blaze at a kosher food business in Sydney. Australian authorities blamed Iran for directing those 2 attacks and expelled the Iranian ambassador. Despite that action, Israel's leaders have accused Albanese's government of being soft on anti Semitism and not doing enough to protect the local Jewish community, which numbers about 120,000 people. Syrian who killed U.S. forces was to be fired, by Jared Malzahn and Michael R. Gordon. The attacker who killed 3 Americans in an ambush on U.S. forces in Syria on Saturday was a member of the Syrian security forces who was set to be fired for holding extremist views, Syrian and U.S. officials said. The attack illustrated the security challenges facing Syria's new president, Ahmed al-Shara, a former Islamist militant who is trying to consolidate control over the country after the collapse of former President Bashar al-Assad's regime last year. The incident also underscored the stakes for President Trump, who met with Shara at the White House in November and embraced him as a partner in combating Islamic State militants, but faces new concerns about the Damascus government's ability to screen its forces and new recruits. Noor Eden El-Baba, a spokesman for Syria's Interior Ministry, said in an interview with the country's national television service that the assailant had been suspected of extremist sympathies in an evaluation issued last week and was set to be dismissed from the security forces on Sunday, the day after the attack. Brown shooting survivors tell of ordeal. Suspect still being sought following deaths of 2 in college rampage. By Neil Mehta, Jared Matovich, and Douglas Belkin. Providence, Rhode Island. Tristan Kaiser Parker, a senior at Brown University, was in a workshop inside the school's Barris and Holly engineering building Saturday afternoon when he heard someone yell, "Intruder." Kaiser Parker sprinted with about 30 students out a side entrance as police converged on the building. The students fled to the 3rd story of a nearby dorm where they sat stunned on the floor. At 4:22 p.m., an alert with the answer no one wanted flashed across campus cell phones. There's an active shooter near Barris and Holly Engineering, it warned. Lock doors, silence phones, and stay hidden until further notice. The gunshots that exploded in an Ivy League lecture hall Saturday afternoon took the lives of 2 students and injured 9 others. Terrified undergrads bolted for safety, huddling for hours inside barricaded campus buildings, while police scrambled to evacuate students and searched for the killer. Authorities released someone they at first described as a person of interest who had been detained early Sunday in Coventry, outside Providence. The manhunt for the killer is continuing, police said. Brown University student Ella Cook was one of the people who were killed, according to her church in Birmingham, Alabama. The Cathedral Church of the Advent described Cook during a Sunday service as an incredibly grounded, generous, and faithful bright light. First-year student Kendall Turner of North Carolina was injured during the shooting, said her high school alma mater, Durham Academy. The school said that she is in critical but stable condition. Of the 9 injured, 7 were in stable condition, 1 was critical, and 1 had been discharged, the mayor said. The day of the shooting, students had been cramming for final exams, taking their test, and getting ready to head off on winter break. Stores lit up for the holidays were bustling. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Chinese amass U.S.-born babies via surrogates. 20 boys to take over the business. By Catherine Long, Ben Foldley, and Ling Ling Wei. Inside a closed Los Angeles courtroom, something wasn't right. Clerks working for family court judge Amy Pellman were reviewing routine surrogacy petitions when they spotted an unusual pattern. The same name again and again. A Chinese billionaire was seeking parental rights to at least 4 unborn children, and the court's additional research showed that he had already fathered or was in the process of fathering at least 8 more, all through surrogates. When Pellman called Zhu Bu in for a confidential hearing in the summer of 2023, he never entered the courtroom, according to people who attended the hearing. The maker of fantasy video games lived in China and appeared via video, speaking through an interpreter. He said he hoped to have 20 or so U.S.-born children through surrogacy, boys, because they're superior to girls, to one day take over his business. Several of his kids were being raised by nannies in nearby Irvine as they awaited paperwork to travel to China. He hadn't yet met them, he told the judge, because work had been busy. Pellman was alarmed, according to the people who attended the hearing. The judge denied his request for parentage, leaving the children in legal limbo. The court declined to comment on Zhu's case. Pellman's decision in the confidential case, which has never been reported, was a rare rebuke to a little-known trend in the largely unregulated U.S. surrogacy industry. Chinese elites and billionaires who are going outside of China, where domestic surrogacy is illegal, to quietly have large numbers of U.S.-born babies. Transportation stocks rally in bullish signal for economy, by Crystal Herr. Transportation stocks are rallying, signaling investor confidence in the economy's outlook. The Dow Jones Transportation Average, which tracks 20 large companies ranging from railroads to airlines, is up 10% this year and approaching a record high. The index recently notched its longest winning streak since August 2020, according to Dow Jones market data, and in recent weeks has left the tech-heavy NASDAQ composite in the dust. Shares of Delta Airlines, Expeditors International, and Ryder System are all up more than 15% this year and recently touched records. Avis Budget Group has risen 63%, while C.H. Robinson Worldwide has gained 52%. Uber Technologies has climbed 41%, and Southwest Airlines has added 22%. The transportation rally is a good sign, some analysts said. Airline, trucking, and railroad stocks are considered market bellwethers, giving their vital roles in moving goods and raw materials that power the economy. U.S.-Ukraine try to break impasse over peace deal. Trump wants Kyiv to strike quick pact, but Zelensky wants security guarantees. By Lawrence Norman, Anastasia Malenko, and Georgy Kanchev, Berlin. President Trump's top envoys held 5 hours of talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Berlin on Sunday, with Washington hailing progress as the administration steps up pressure on Kyiv to seal a deal with Russia to end the war by the end of the year. The talks between Ukraine and its Western partners have become a tug of war, even without Russia at the table. Washington is pushing for quick decisions, while Zelensky and his European backers contend that significant differences remain. Talks will continue on Monday, and several European leaders plan to join. Among the key points of contention, Ukraine has balked at Washington's call to withdraw its forces from a portion of the eastern Donbass region that Kyiv's forces still hold. European and Ukrainian officials have pushed for clarity on what the U.S. would do if Russia were to break a peace deal and attack Ukraine. Both issues will be at the heart of the talks in Berlin. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz proposed the meetings during a talk European leaders held with Trump on Wednesday. After Sunday's discussions ended, the Trump administration's Russian envoy, Steve Witkoff, said on X that the two sides held in-depth discussions on the peace plan. A lot of progress was made, and they will meet again tomorrow morning, he said. One person briefed on Sunday's talks described them as difficult, saying the U.S. side appeared unwilling to compromise on its proposal. Russian officials have said the U.S. plan is a good basis for discussion, but haven't said whether they would accept it. Many European officials doubt the Kremlin is looking to wind down the war. They have said Europe and all North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries face the risk that if Russia prevails in Ukraine, the Kremlin will set its sights on conflict with European neighbors. Throughout the recent weeks of talks, Russia has bombarded Ukrainian cities and energy infrastructure. Zelensky said hundreds of thousands of families were without electricity Sunday morning. Ukraine on Wednesday sent Washington its response to an earlier U.S. proposal for ending the war, which started almost 4 years ago with Russia's invasion. While there is agreement on some points, including a cap of 80,000 troops on Ukraine's peacetime armed forces, Kyiv has continued to reject the U.S. push for it to surrender territory in the Donetsk province that Ukrainian troops still hold. The U.S. plan would stipulate that Kyiv agree not to fight to win back swaths of territory it has lost to Russia elsewhere, and may entail Washington formally recognizing Moscow's annexation of parts of Ukraine. It would also further complicate Kyiv's hopes of eventually joining NATO, while potentially bringing Russia back into the global economy, including through joint U.S.-Russian projects. Hong Kong court convicts publisher, by Austin Ramsey, Hong Kong. A Hong Kong court convicted media tycoon Jimmy Lai of violating the Chinese territory's national security law, a ruling that could force the 78-year-old mainstay of the city's battered pro-democracy movement to spend the rest of his life in prison. President Trump said earlier this year that he would do everything he could to save Lai, whose case has been portrayed in the West as an emblem of Chinese political persecution. The UK and European Parliament have also called for Lai's release. Chinese officials have rejected such appeals as interference in Hong Kong's legal system. The conviction handed down by Hong Kong's High Court on Monday carries a possible life sentence, though the longest term imposed in previous national security cases has been 10 years. Lai was also convicted on the lesser charge of violating Hong Kong's sedition law. His sentencing will take place later. Lai has been in custody since 2020. Trump said in October that he would raise Lai's case with Chinese leader Xi Jinping at their meeting that month in South Korea, but neither side mentioned the case in official statements that followed. That summit focused on easing trade tensions between the U.S. and China, potentially moving sensitive topics such as Lai's imprisonment to the two leaders' next meeting, expected to take place in Beijing in April. Lai's family and supporters say his health has declined, and closing arguments for his trial were postponed so he could be given medicine and a monitor for heart palpitations. Authorities say he is receiving adequate and comprehensive medical attention. Lai was a clothing magnate when, in the mid-1990s, he founded Apple Daily, a newspaper that became one of the city's most read publications, grabbing attention with bright colors, vivid photos, and sometimes racy coverage. The paper angered Chinese officials with its relentless criticism of China's ruling Communist Party and support for protest movements in Hong Kong. When Beijing clamped down on Hong Kong protest by imposing a national security law on the city in 2020, Lai was a target. The law has been used to imprison dozens of former opposition lawmakers and activists, effectively shutting down the pro-democracy movement. Post-war Gaza troop appeal falls short. U.S. presses other countries to send help, but none have stepped forward yet. By Alexander Ward, Robbie Gramer, and Benoit Falcon, Washington. Trump administration officials are seeking to recruit a multinational force of around 10,000 troops under a U.S. general to stabilize post-war Gaza, officials say, but acknowledge it will take much of the next year to get them in place. No foreign countries have yet committed troops, partly over reservations that the mission could expand to include disarming Hamas militants who remain active in parts of the shattered enclave, officials said. Even the two nations, U.S. officials say, are on the verge of sending troops. Azerbaijan and Indonesia favor a narrower mandate that wouldn't involve them in potentially lethal operations. Some U.S. officials are hopeful they will secure commitments for up to 5,000 troops early next year and will raise that to 10,000 total by the end of 2026. Others say the force is unlikely to ever have more than 8,000 personnel, far fewer than U.S. officials aim to recruit. Michael Singh, a former National Security Council official who handled Middle East issues in the George W. Bush administration, said a stabilization force that avoids confronting Hamas might create new problems. Peacekeepers who are unwilling to use force risk creating a worst-case scenario for Israel, a force that not only fails to disarm Hamas, but acts as cover for the group's rearmament and an obstacle to Israel's freedom of action, he said. The U.S. State Department on Monday formally asked more than 70 countries for their military or financial contributions to the security force, officials said, ranging from close allies such as Italy and France to smaller countries including Malta and El Salvador. The message says Middle East countries, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, are already in discussions with the U.S. to fund the Gaza effort, noting that they will require consistent engagement for specific asks. A U.S. official said 19 countries have responded, expressing interest in contributing troops or helping in other ways, such as providing equipment, transportation, or logistics support. More than 25 countries are expected to meet in Qatar this week for a U.S.-led meeting to make plans for the force's composition and the scope of the mission, officials said. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the editorial page, a day of terror amid the holiday season. Shootings in Syria, Rhode Island, and Australia, and more. It was a bloody 24 hours. First, 3 Americans were killed and 3 wounded on Saturday by an ISIS terrorist in Syria's security forces. Then 2 students were killed and 9 injured in a shooting at Brown University, whose motive is unknown as we write. Next, at least 15 were killed and 40 injured in a terrorist attack on a Hanukkah celebration in Australia. On Friday, German police arrested 5 men, 3 Moroccans, a Syrian, and an Egyptian, on suspicion of planning an attack on a Christmas market. That night, a Jewish home in Redlands, California, was shot up. The Anti-Defamation League, which is in touch with the victim, says a suspect shouted anti-Semitic slurs and fired approximately 20 rounds into the home, which was clearly decorated with Hanukkah decorations. With time, we will learn more. But for now, we can say this. While the global war on terrorism may have ended, the global terrorist war on the rest of us hasn't. The shooter in Syria, who killed 2 Iowa National Guard soldiers and a U.S. interpreter, can't be dismissed as a lone infiltrator. President Ahmed al-Shara has made a momentous shift to bring Syria into the American orbit. But, as these pages have warned, some of the foreign jihadists who fought alongside him have been made commanders in the Syrian army. U.S. Envoy Tom Barrack said the attack underscores the need for the residual U.S. force in Syria to keep ISIS down. President Trump has brought Syria sanctions relief, and the least Mr. Shara now owes in return is to purge his forces of these elements, especially in the upper ranks. In Australia, police identified the shooters as father and son, the latter named Avid Akram, reportedly of Pakistani origin. They fired into a Jewish crowd, killing men, women, and children. Australia has seen worsening anti-Semitic incitement and Iran-sponsored attacks on Jews since October 7, 2023, while the Labour government joined the Liberals against Israel. Among the dead is Shabbat Rabbi Eli Schlanger, ordained in Brooklyn. Also shot was the young Rabbi Leibel Lazaroff of College Station, Texas, where his family serves the Jews of Texas A&M. He's in the ICU. A hero is fruit vendor Ahmed Ahmed, who rushed one of Sydney's shooters and wrestled his gun away. He was shot and wounded, while a witness accused police of standing back. The ghastly toll is a reminder of the continuing danger from Islamic terrorism. U.S. soldiers in the Middle East, Christians in the heart of Europe, and Jews as far-flung as Australia are all considered targets. Guan Heng's fate and American values. The U.S. may deport the man who helped expose the horrors of Xinjiang. An asylum hearing in upstate New York on Monday will determine the fate of Guan Heng. The decision will also speak volumes about whether America still protects those who speak up for freedom at great risk to themselves. Guan Heng is a 38-year-old Chinese immigrant who fled the People's Republic after he gathered evidence of human rights abuses against the ethnic Uyghur population in Xinjiang province. Following satellite coordinates he downloaded from Western sources, he traveled across Xinjiang to investigate the re-education camps and detention sites that China says don't exist. His story is an astonishing credit to Guan Heng's desire to live in freedom, as recounted in an article by Lu Jingwei in Human Rights in China on Substack, on which this editorial is based. As a young man in Henan province, Guan Heng found a way to evade Chinese internet censors and access foreign news. He was fascinated, in particular, by satellite photos of alleged concentration camps in Xinjiang, and he decided to see for himself. It's hard to imagine a riskier trek, but he managed to pull it off, traveling through cities and towns with a telephoto lens. He returned home, but knew that if he disclosed the photos online from inside China, he would be discovered and arrested. He decided to leave China through Hong Kong, traveling first to Ecuador, then the Bahamas, where he bought a boat and sailed without sailing experience toward Florida. On the coast, he abandoned the boat, made his way into the U.S., and released his photos that went viral on the internet and validated what the satellite photos had highlighted. According to Mr. Liu, Guan Heng sought asylum in New York on October 25, 2021, received a work permit, and began to make a living as an Uber driver in New York City, among other jobs. He settled in a town near Albany this spring and shared a house with a Chinese couple, quietly making a living. Then heroism became tragedy. Guan Heng's supporters say U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents raided the house in August looking for the couple. They arrested Guan Heng when he acknowledged that he had entered the country illegally. Mr. Liu reports that ICE didn't recognize Guan Heng's work permit in pursuit of asylum because he entered the U.S. illegally. He has since spent months in detention, most recently in the Broome County Correctional Facility. It's hard to imagine a stronger case for asylum. The Chinese government has attacked Guan Heng relentlessly since he was identified as the source of the Xinjiang photos. His relatives in China have been harassed and threatened. If he is deported to China, Guan Heng is sure to be arrested and sentenced to decades in prison, if not tortured. Is this the message the land of the free wants to send the world? That if you risk your life to expose human rights abuses and then risk it again to make it to America, the home of the brave will serve as the police force for the Chinese Communist Party? It's hard to believe, but then you never know in this era of mass deportation that has disrupted lives and broken up so many law-abiding families. Let's hope that Mr. Guan is granted asylum to live freely in his adopted country that was once and must continue to be a beacon for liberty. From the opinion pages, does MAHA stand for Make America High Again? Reclassifying marijuana flies in the face of Trump and RFK Jr.'s professed concern about health. By Elisa Finley. What happened to making America healthy again? President Trump is expected soon to order that marijuana be reclassified as a Schedule III drug, the class that includes anabolic steroids and Tylenol with codeine. That would legalize marijuana, but it would ease tax restrictions on growers and sellers in states with permissive laws. And it would send a signal despite mounds of evidence. Go ahead, inhale. It's all good. That's what the marijuana lobby wants Americans to believe, and many do. Younger generations are increasingly adopting the so-called California sober lifestyle, abstaining from hard drugs and alcohol while using marijuana and psychedelics. As marijuana has become more widely available and accepted, more young people are using it, and they are becoming sicker and dumber as a result. Since 2010, the share of Americans who have used marijuana in the past 30 days has doubled to 29% among those 19 to 30 and tripled to 25% among 35-year-olds, according to this year's Monitoring the Future survey of drug use. Among 35-year-olds, roughly 1 in 8 uses marijuana every day. Only 1 in 20 drink alcohol daily. The MAHA movement is right that ultra-processed foods are a problem, but pot may be worse than fried Oreos washed down with a pint of Guinness. A study presented at the American College of Cardiology this spring found that cannabis users younger than 50 were 6 times as likely to suffer a heart attack and 4 times as likely to experience strokes as non-users. Cannabis increases pressure on blood vessels and can cause dysregulation of cardiac muscles, not to mention bring on the munchies. Trump administration health officials are sounding alarms that COVID mRNA vaccines can cause myocarditis in young men, but how about a PSA about marijuana harms? Maybe a poop emoji with the caption, "This is your brain on marijuana," lest anyone forget why marijuana users are referred to as potheads. THC, marijuana's psychoactive ingredient, soaks into the brain and binds to receptors that are involved in executive functioning, decision-making, coordination, memory, and emotion. Teenage brains are especially vulnerable to the drug's ill effects and have shown changes on medical imaging that are linked to impaired decision making and psychosis. A study this year found the share of schizophrenic cases associated with cannabis use disorder nearly tripled after Canada liberalized its marijuana laws. Other studies have found marijuana increases aggressive behavior, suicidal ideation, and depression, especially troubling since some use the drug to allay mental troubles. A startling study from Canada this year found that patients who had been hospitalized with cannabis use disorder were nearly 3 times as likely to die within the following 5 years after controlling for demographic factors and health conditions, and nearly 10 times as likely to kill themselves. Trump health officials and many in the MAHA crowd are taking aim at SSRI antidepressants, which can cause suicidal thoughts in teens. But at least these drugs have undergone randomized controlled trials and been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. Marijuana hasn't. Rescheduling marijuana based on anecdotal evidence of its medicinal benefits would be inconsistent with the FDA's drive to raise the bar for approving vaccines and therapies. It would be mind-bending for the administration to make it easier and more profitable for marijuana businesses to sell a dangerous drug without proving any benefits. Here's another MAHA contradiction. Trump officials have raised false alarm that using Tylenol during pregnancy increases the risk of children later developing autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The most robust studies have found no link. Evidence is much stronger that marijuana increases childhood neurodevelopmental disorders. Pregnant women who use pot are at higher risk of miscarriages and premature births, and their children are more likely to show behavioral problems, including ADHD. A 2021 study from the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai found that children who were exposed to pot in the womb exhibited increased anxiety, aggression, and hyperactivity. Studies have also found that marijuana degrades the quality of sperm and reduces fertility. Not to mention that young men who spend their days playing video games while getting high in their parents' basements aren't especially attractive partners. Vice President J.D. Vance has blamed declining fertility and marriage rates on cat ladies, women who choose the single life. Maybe they don't want to be a caretaker of a man-child who uses pot to check out of work and the world. Employers in industries like construction, manufacturing, and trucking say they can't find workers who can pass a drug test, with marijuana use being the top reason. Has Mr. Trump spoken to them, or parents whose kids have killed themselves as a result of cannabis-induced psychosis? Puff by puff, marijuana is sapping American economic and cultural vitality. It's the antithesis of MAGA. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Kathy Hochul faces a life or death decision. New York's governor touts her efforts at preventing suicide. She should veto an assisted suicide bill. by Jack Butler, New York. On a cold, windy December night, a bundled up group gathered outside a midtown Manhattan office building. Some were in wheelchairs, a few waved signs, others held candles. They had come to Governor Kathy Hochul's New York City office to oppose a bill legalizing assisted suicide. The legislature passed the bill in June. Its fate is now in Miss Hochul's hands. If she doesn't veto it, the bill will pass automatically and threaten New York's most vulnerable, like some of those who gathered in the front of her office on December 4th. 12 states and the District of Columbia currently allow some form of what is euphemistically called medical aid in dying. That some places have already gone down this path shouldn't automatically entail an endorsement. The record in other places has shown the dark places legalization leads. Requests for assisted suicide require a motivating, dire diagnosis, but legalized jurisdictions have stretched the meaning of dire. Bills like New York's, once enacted, have led to people with conditions like anorexia, diabetes, high cholesterol, high blood pressure being abandoned by their physician and given lethal drugs, says Jessica Rogers, 36, Coalition's Director for the Patients' Rights Action Fund. Ms. Rogers was present at the city gathering after attending another in Albany the day before. Particularly disturbing about the assisted suicide slippery slope is the increased risk to the physically or mentally disabled. Altering state law in this way encourages both public and private actors in the healthcare system to make callous calculations about whether their patients' lives are worth living. It's the people who are vulnerable who end up as the target of bills like this, says Sharon Shapiro Lax, 64, Executive Director of the Brooklyn Center for Independence of the Disabled. People, that is, like her. Ms. Shapiro came to protest the bill in her wheelchair. She requires help to get through the day and fears that this bill, if enacted, would make New Yorkers forget that a life is a life. She fears people like her would come to be seen as a burden on those around them, or even come to think of themselves that way. If one life is lost needlessly, or shut or ended early because of this, that is one life too many, said Jose Hernandez, 45, Advocacy and Policy Associate at New York Association on Independent Living. He also came to the vigil in a wheelchair. Mr. Hernandez recalled the example of his mother, diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, the kind of condition that would furnish a rationale in this bill's understanding. Told she had 6 months, she lived for 13 years. Governor Hochul has suggested adding safeguards to the bill, including a 7-day waiting period, a mental health evaluation, and restriction of life-ending drugs to New York residents only. But the record in other states shows that such safeguards usually fade before the inexorable logic of physician-assisted suicide. 6 of the 12 jurisdictions that have legalized assisted suicide have since loosened their initial criteria. The record of U.S. jurisdictions where assisted suicide is already legal provides plenty of reason to worry. But there is another source of concern beyond our borders. Canada, which shares a border with New York, long ago abandoned the terminal illness requirement for requesting assisted suicide. Now, a range of illnesses and conditions can justify a request for lethal treatment. The criteria up north may get looser still. There have already been many cases of people requesting and receiving assisted suicide, even though their conditions are treatable. There is evidence some have done so without a full understanding of what they were doing, possibly under pressure from care providers. Assisted suicide is now the 5th leading cause of death in the country, according to a report from Cardis, a Canadian think tank. There are other reasons to be worried about a regime of assisted suicide in New York. The possible proliferation of lethal drugs in circulation on the streets. Pressure placed on doctors and nurses who oppose the practice to participate in it. The erosion of medical care's fundamental nature as life-giving, hence the American Medical Association's continued opposition to the practice. But Ms. Hochul herself might be most receptive to one particular argument. She has made suicide prevention one of the hallmarks of her administration. She declared September Suicide Prevention Month and noted she had increased state funding for suicide prevention. Why prevent suicide on the one hand and open up an entirely new avenue for it on the other? Even in New York, on a cold night at the end of a workday, passing drivers stuck in traffic honked and gestured in approval of the assembled vigil. Miss Hochul should listen to those gathered outside and to everyone else standing against the culture of death this bill would usher in. Mr. Butler is a deputy opinion editor at the Journal. Letter to the editor, a double standard for death. William McGurn establishes the stakes of Governor Kathy Hochul's assisted suicide decision. Here's how I see it. Approving a lethal dose only for people whose life expectancy is under 6 months means the government is valuing their lives less than those of healthy people. A little poem I wrote a few years ago indicates why disability rights groups consider the double standard discriminatory. Quote, "If you seek to end your life, will you get support or strife? Healthy people meet resistance. Sick, old people get assistance." From Professor Felicia Nemu Ackerman, Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the December 15th, 2025 issue of the Wall Street Journal, which we read every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening.